these are some memories I have of my grandfather and grandmother, uh, Vito Sinacori and Marianna Pisano Sinacori. My grandfather, we called him Nonno, Vito Sinacori, was born on August 23rd, 1925, in Sant'Anifa, Sicily. As a little boy, my dad told me that my grandfather was kind of like a shepherd in the fields, and that's what he did for work. And he met my grandmother when he was around, I believe, in his late teens, maybe 18, 19, 20, around that time. And he was being forced to marry the oldest daughter of her family instead of the youngest daughter. So my grandfather liked my grandmother Marianna best out of all the sisters that she had, and that's who he wanted to marry. So they broke with tradition and they got married in I believe April of 1947. And then my grandmother Marianna Pisano Sinacori, who we called Nonna, was born on January 31st, 1928 in Salemi, Sicily. And she was one of several daughters in the family. She had several sisters. I was only familiar with two of them because out of her and her other two sisters, they moved to America with their families. The other sisters stayed in Salemi, Sicily area with their families over the years. She had sisters, Mattia, I'm trying to remember here. She had a few sisters. Mattia was the oldest, I believe, and Nardina. And then there was Paulina. They stayed with their families in Sicily. But my grandmother and her other two sisters, Josie and Biaggia, they moved their families to America. Josie Palermo and Biaggia Grassa, they moved their families to America. And they settled in the Lawrence, Massachusetts and Haverhill, Massachusetts areas when they moved to America in the 1970s at some point. The deciding factor that made my grandparents move to America was in 1968 there was a devastating earthquake in the city of Salemi. My grandfather, after he married my grandmother, they settled in her home city of Salemi. And they lived, I believe, near a hillside. And in the middle of the night, there was shaking going on, and my grandfather got everybody up, and they ran into the streets. And they were shouting to get everyone out into the streets, out of all the neighbors. None of the neighbors left their houses. So my family were the only survivors of that earthquake in 1968. Speaking of the family, my grandparents had several kids. There was a son named Gaetano, but he died. And then there was my father, Gaetano. Then there was another son named Peter, but he died a few months into infancy. And then there was Vita, and then Pina, and then Joanne and Pietra. So my grandparents, in the end, out of the surviving kids, had one son, who was my father, and 4 daughters. So they moved to America in 1970, in January, the beginning part of January of 1970. And at that time, my dad, who was born on June 15th, but was registered on the 20th of 1950, he was, I believe, He was 19 years old when he moved to America with my grandparents and his sisters. Because in 1970, that's the year he would have been turning 20 years old. My grandfather was a laborer for Brock's Construction in the Merrimack Valley here in Massachusetts. And the family settled on Bartlett Street in Haverhill, Massachusetts, not too far from Fantini Bakery, where it is now, in Haverhill. And Bobo Subs in that Washington Street area of Haverhill, near downtown. And they lived there throughout the 1970s, and then in 1983, they moved to a house on newly built split ranch house on Derry Road in Methuen, Massachusetts. My grandfather worked a side job on the weekends on Saturdays for the Tattersall Farm in Haverhill, tending to the surviving sisters and brother, who were still living at the time. They were all single, they had never married, and they were still living on the farm, but they had operated up until around the 1960s, I believe, and early 70s. And then when the farm ended, they were too old to tend to it, so my grandfather helped them out by cutting the lawn and trimming the hedges and doing yard work throughout the 1970s. And then when he was too old to do that, he passed that job on to my dad in the 1980s. My grandmother, Marianna, my Nonna, she was mostly a homemaker in Sicily. And then when she moved to America, she worked with my dad in the 1970s and into 1980s and early 90s at Cardinal Shoe in Lawrence, Massachusetts as a fancy stitcher. My grandmother, she loved to cook, she loved to crochet, she loved to sew, she loved to bake cookies and all different kind of dishes, pastas, lasagna, meatballs, sausages, lots of food for Christmas, many foods for Christmas, but like bacala and sfingy and all different kind of pastas for Christmas. In 1997, in April, my Nonna and Nonno celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at Pat's Beef House in Haverhill, Massachusetts, which was a popular function hall at the time. A few years before this, in 1991, they were sent back to Sicily because the city had rebuilt the house for them that was destroyed in the earthquake in 1968. So they had to be there to accept it. So at that time, they stayed until the spring of 1993. They stayed there as the house was being finished. And my grandfather loved it there because he was seeing old family members again. And his plan was to stay 6 months out of the year there and then come home to Methuen, Massachusetts, and live 6 months there with my grandmother. And that never came to be because while they were in Sicily, my grandmother had to have an emergency gallbladder operation. And when she came out of it, she wasn't the same. My grandfather noticed that. She wasn't the same. Her memory wasn't the same. So we're thinking that the doctor probably used too much anesthesia during the surgery because she remembered her family, but she was forgetting things. So when she came home that spring of 1993, everyone saw she was a lot different and they knew something was up. So before my grandparents had their 50th anniversary, we all were seeing that she was not the same person. She was slowly forgetting things, and they had to keep reminding her of who people were and where things were. So shortly after my grandparents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, my grandfather had a quadruple bypass. I believe it was in July of 1997. And he was sent to the Whittier Rehab in Salem, New Hampshire to recover. He was all set to recover and come home on August 5th, 1997, when he began complaining of stomach pains. And the doctors weren't sure what to do. So they took him to the Holy Family Hospital in Methuen, and they weren't sure what was going on. So they were ready to fly him ready to airlift him to Boston. But he passed away right then and there around, I believe, 5:30 at night on August 5th, 1997, as his kidneys ruptured. So after that point, my grandmother lived alone for about a year to two more at the house on Derry Road. Nobody wanted to put her in the nursing home because my grandfather, that was against his wishes. But it wasn't possible. Like, she was putting the gas on and leaving the gas on, and it was just an accident waiting to happen. And she was going out into the street getting lost. So in 1999, in June, she entered the Mary Immaculate Nursing Home, and she lived there until 2003 on September 3rd, 2003. She passed away after having a blood clot in her leg after she broke her hip. So that's the story of my Nonna and my Nonno, Vito and Marianna Pisano Sinacori. And one thing I forgot to mention about my grandfather was he loved to garden. He was a typical Italian gardener. He loved to garden and plant vegetables and fruits and flowers. And he loved his wine. So that's just a little something about my grandfather, my Nonno, that was a characteristic of his. When people knew him, they knew him as a gardener, and they knew he loved his wine. And my grandmother, she loved to cook. She was a baker and a cooker.